At the conclusion of the War of 1812, we've noticed that there would be a rising tide of nationalism in this country. People were now identifying as Americans because of the common experience of defeating the British, considered at that time the preeminent power in the world. So America was going to change in many ways, not just in pride of their country. There would be a population explosion, the likes of which this country had not seen before. Combination of a high, extremely high birth rate, longer living because of better dietary and uh, geographic influences, and there would be an explosion in immigration. All of this would push the United States closer towards Thomas Jefferson's vision of America, and that, of course, would be one of an agricultural country. Because if there's one resource this country had, it was land and plenty of it. So this was this inexorable push westward. The Indian threat for uh, many had been removed. And so going west to the Mississippi and beyond did not seem to be uh, challenging in terms of fighting to get the land. Now, there would be other developments that were going to push some of these changes. One would be developments in Europe. Europe is going to uh, experience some rather challenging weather anomalies, which would lead to great famine. And that, of course, would lead to people start looking towards the New World for relief. So people coming from Europe to America, the Irish in particular, are going to provide a great deal of that immigration because partially of the British persecution of the Irish as they tightened their hold on that Emerald Isle. There was also attractions in the United States that brought many people here. For one, the banks, particularly the Bank of the United States, have provided economic stability, stability for people's investment, stability in terms of uh, the, the national currency. So all of that combined with the freedoms that people had here that were not available readily in Europe. And then, of course, there was the growth of slavery. Slavery would continue to grow in the South now as cotton became a major uh, production item. Land was available so that more cotton could be farmed, and that, of course, would increase the slavery in the United States. This would then be the beginnings, thanks in part again to the War of 1812 and necessity being the mother of invention, to the Industrial Revolution in this country. Industrial Revolution had been going on in Europe for some time now, and of course was slow to catch on in the United States. But again, with the blockade that the British had instituted at the beginning of the War of 1812, necessity pushed us into this sphere. That was going to lead to increased improvements in transportation, roads, canals, railroads, etc., would help spur on this industrial growth. So let's take a look at the revolution in transportation in this country. One of the first things that was going to be improved were roads. Now, understand, roads in this country are not the same as what you think of when you hear that term. I'll give you an example. The oldest road in South Jersey is Kings Highway. Now, think of the term highway. What do you automatically envision? Well, that was not the case. Imagine, if you will, a path uh, barely wide enough for two horses to fit down. And then think about how that path was formed. You had trees that were everywhere. They had to be taken out. Now, if you've ever heard the term, I'm stumped, I've been stumped, you automatically think of course, not being able to figure out an answer to a problem. But the origins of that term were the tree stumps that were left in the road. And if you traveled that road at night, your horse would be gutted by those stumps sticking up. So they've been stumped, a little bit different than what we think of. Eventually, some farmers became rather industrious. And what they did was to allow shortcuts through their properties. And that would wear a path from one road to another. Now, what they would do is they would station perhaps one of their children there at the beginning of that path across their land. And he would take a spear, which at that time was called a pike. They would turn it upside down so the handle stuck out. Those particular spears, those pikes, were long rods with a handle sticking out from the side. Well, now they would stick the pike in the ground, handle sticking out over the path. So if you wanted to cross that path, you paid your penny to go through. Then they would turn the pike. And that, of course, is the origins of the term turnpikes. Turnpikes were going to be built everywhere. And the United States government would build one of the first. As you see there in 1806, they authorized the construction of the National Road going from Maryland all the way to Illinois. This again was to do two things. One, to bring commerce from west into east, and of course, obviously vice versa. But it also would allow for the smoother transition, particularly of immigrants, to go west and to settle those lands, which at the time owned by the government, and this was their major source of income, selling that land, and of course, pushing the Indians further and further west.
In the year 1810, even though the United States was struggling financially, the government decided to embark on the nation's first big public improvement project. This project was the National Road, also known as the Cumberland Road or Great National Pike. By the time it was finished 28 years later, this long gravel-paved highway ran all the way from Cumberland, Maryland, across a corner of Pennsylvania, through Ohio and Indiana, to the town of Vandalia, Illinois. The National Road played a very important role in the history of the United States, for by providing easy access to the lands beyond the Ohio River, it opened up the region to both increased settlement and trade. In fact, during the early years of Madison's presidency, although there were 7 million Americans, only 1 million of them lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. But with the coming of the National Road, the number of Westerners rapidly increased, and as more and more white settlers started to farm Western lands, Native Americans were forced to move to places that had not yet been settled by whites. As work on the National Road was just getting underway in 1811, 2 American Indian brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, forged an alliance of native tribes to halt white settlement. Trouble broke out when future U.S. President William Henry Harrison showed up at their village in the Indiana Territory with a force of 1,000 U.S. soldiers and was attacked by Tenskwatawa's warriors. As a result of what came to be called the Battle of Tippecanoe, the Indian allies were defeated, and Harrison became a hero to white Americans. That same year, after a failed slave revolt in the Louisiana Territory, 66 slaves were beheaded, and their heads were staked along the roadways as a warning to others who might have similar ideas about gaining freedom. Meanwhile, far away in the roadless Pacific Northwest, John Jacob Astor established the fur trading outpost of Fort Astoria in the Oregon Territory at the mouth of the Columbia River. Fort Astoria was the very first permanent American settlement on the west coast of North America.
So you can see that there are various factors all coming into play here. and how those things which led to America's improvement also led to war, and of course, some downtime, if you will, for the various groups that purchased or had the land that the United States was after. The next big development in the transportation arena would, of course, be the steamboat. Robert Fulton took an idea that had first been used in England and stuck a steam engine on what essentially was a raft. Eventually, his first steamboat, known as the Clermont, showed that rivers could be navigated in both directions. This was going to lead to a rather ingenious idea by the governor of New York, a gentleman by the name of Clinton, no relation to the current Clintons living in New York. He is going to push for the development of what becomes known as the Erie Canal. That canal, close to 400 miles in length, dug from Lake Erie all the way to the Hudson River, was going to provide a shortcut, if you will, straight through New York State, rather than have to take goods down the Mississippi River and then through the Gulf around Florida and up, or cross the mountains in order to get to the East Coast. The Erie Canal was going to prove to be a commercial windfall and would be almost directly responsible for the rise of that commercial giant that, of course, would be New York City. If you take a look at that picture, you'll see how the canals worked. Obviously, there were no flow one way or the other. And what individuals would be able to do was to have their barges towed. If you look to the left here, you'll see the tow path, and the horses would pull the boats down and back along the Erie Canal. Some gentlemen, a little bit more in efforts to get down the thing faster, would actually use poles to push themselves through. The Erie Canal would take somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 to 15 years. And that was going to push a boom in canal building. Now, you see the canal and its offshoots that were dug through New York, ending somewhere around Albany. Now, of course, today, it's not used near as much as it was in the past, but it has become a rather scenic tourist destination. One of the things that helped build the Erie Canal was, of course, the advent of the huge Irish migration. Most of the workers on the canal were Irishmen. And again, remember, you didn't have dynamite back then. You didn't have front end loaders or any mechanical means of really digging except strictly by hand. And of course, remember, those canals had to go up and over hills, down and up. So steps had to be built, locks had to be built in order to fill one with water and let the water out of another set of locks as they went up the steps or down the steps. The same type of individualism that would be used in the building of the great granddaddy of them all, and that, of course, would be the Panama Canal. This is an original map of the canal building. Now, the next big development would be the Iron Horse. First built by a gentleman in England by the name of Peter Cooper. And his first railroad car, which you see right there, was called Tom Thumb because of its small size. But eventually, it would come to the United States, and by 1850, the United States had more railroad miles in track than all the rest of the world combined. It becomes, and then we're talking about the railroad, the major source of transportation by 1850 in this country. And if you take a look at that map, you'll be able to pick up something else. And that something else is, notice where the bulk of the canals, roads, and railroads are. They're in the north and they're running west. Very few in comparison to the south. The south was stuck in one respect, and I don't mean against their will, but they were stuck in the past. What they did was working fine for them, and they didn't need those transportation improvements. Whereas the North, this was going to prompt a lot of uh, back and forth between East and West, eventually uniting them, eventually uh, bringing immigrants back and forth, if you will, and thus creating a common culture. That was not going to be the way down south. And this would actually lead to more disunity within the country than was thought of. This man, Eli Whitney, a school teacher from Massachusetts, one day in the early 1800s, goes and visits his aunt in South Carolina. She was bemoaning the fact that slavery and its way of life was slowly disappearing because the difficulty in picking cotton and then taking the seeds out of the cotton just proved to be uh, ineffective in terms of cost. Well, Eli Whitney played around with a little invention that we know eventually becomes the cotton gin. Not much bigger than the box you see on that screen, but that was going to revolutionize the cotton picking and, of course, made the South the richest area or region in the United States. Unfortunately for Whitney, he is given uh, undeserved credit for the continuation of slavery. That was never his intent. And ironically, actually, his biggest contribution to the American industrial growth was not the cotton gin. He comes up with a system of interchangeable parts. Example, if you bought a musket back in those days, if the trigger broke or the hammer broke or the barrel got bent, you had to buy a whole new gun because these were each individually built and they didn't make parts for them. Whitney takes and makes parts and then has them assembled so that they were easily repaired and made a lot faster. Eventually, his new company gets the contract with the United States government to produce their weapons. So the system of interchangeable parts and assembly line production begins with Eli Whitney. But it is the cotton gin that, of course, attracts the most attention. As you take a look at the various graphs down there, cotton eventually becomes king. Most of the millionaires in this country would live in the South. Just Mississippi and Alabama alone had more millionaires in it than the entire North, East, and West combined. Now, does that mean that they were economically better off, top to bottom, than the rest of the country? It does not. They become a one product land. And diversification, which is the key to stability, is not in the South. Everybody was trying to get on that cotton bandwagon. Everybody was trying to grow their king cotton. But of course, with the expansion of the cotton industry, as you see down there, the expansion of slavery. So you see, again, the economic, cultural, and political differences. Politics in the South were designed to do one thing: protect their peculiar institution. And the culture, there was a growing gap between rich and poor. There was not much of a middle class. And again, there was no economic diversification. Meanwhile, in the North and the East, with the advent of industrialization, you're going to have the rise of large cities. And again, there is a circular motion in all of this. And what I mean by that is, as more tasks became industrialized, the production of certain things were no longer necessary on the farms. So that meant that many of the children, particularly girls, were not needed at home. So they gravitated towards cities where they got their jobs in industry, and well, and it just keeps going around and around and around. introduced the growth of the factory system. And one of the men responsible for that was an English immigrant by the name of Samuel Slater. Now, keep in mind that England wanted to have a monopoly on machine made goods. So they pass a law which made it punishable by death any person that took the plans for their machinery out of the country. So that way they were keeping proprietary control of their industrial system. United States, being Americans, we offer tremendous bribes to anybody that could sneak over here with those plans. One such man was Samuel Slater, who was an engineer in one of the factories, took the plans, hid them, came over here disguised as an agriculturalist, a farmer, got to the United States, got his reward, and thus began the growth of the factory system as pioneered by that man, Francis Lowell. Lowell, after whom Lowell, Massachusetts is named, he puts together the ideas of Eli Whitney with mass production, builds buildings that will house these machines, and then builds apartments, if you will, directly next to them. So you never had to leave the grounds in order to go from your home to work and back home again. And this becomes the efficient factory system. And along with it comes something called the market revolution. Take a look at the picture there. And there you see the main drivers behind this market revolution. The salesman bringing his goods directly to the families of the West. And in this particular instance, notice who most of the people are that are looking at these goods. And of course, it's women. So the market revolution, as I stated earlier, is going to take the production of certain necessities out of the home, put them in the factories, and then those goods would be brought directly to the American farmer. So as this industrialization creeped across the country and made goods a little bit easier to get, it also fed into another phenomenon. And that is something that this country has held on to for a long, long time. And that, of course, is the idea or the concept of manifest destiny, this inexorable push to go west. The population was growing immensely, more so than any other part of Europe. Take a look, for example, between 1790 and 1820. That's only a 30-year time period. New York, the state's population quadrupled. Kentucky's 8 times. Ohio became one of the most populous states in the entire Union. So, within a single generation, they occupied more territory than they had occupied in the previous 150 years. And of course, this was going to lead to the displacement of the American Indians. So this dramatic growth, both in population and in the type of economy, was going to push America ever westward. And with it would come something from the President of the United States, whose vision saw us as an agricultural giant. And this would be something known as Jeffersonian democracy. In it, individual rights were cherished and protected. Of course, protected in the Bill of Rights, which was written and put onto the Constitution long before Thomas Jefferson became president. But he was going to make sure the government protected these rights. He insisted on separation of church and state, despite the Great Awakening, and then there was the Second Great Awakening. He cherished the right to vote, but did not necessarily believe in extending it past people who owned land. And Jeffersonian democracy valued states' rights. Remember, when the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed under John Adams during the quasi war with France, Jefferson and Madison wrote the Virginia and Kentucky Resolves, which lionized state rights and pushed a theory called nullification, where the states could declare laws passed by Congress unconstitutional and refuse to obey them. So Jeffersonian democracy um, extended rights to more people, but not to everyone. And there were some seeds planted in that could lead to the dissolution of this union.
But in the early 1800s, the Supreme Court changed, largely due to one person, John Marshall, who was Chief Justice, or head of the court, from 1801 to 1835. Under Marshall, the Supreme Court decided a number of cases that dramatically increased the court's power. One important case involved a dispute between New York and New Jersey over who should be allowed to operate steamships in the waters of New York. Imagine if today, New York passed a law giving only a few people the right to operate ships in New York Harbor. And imagine if boat owners from New Jersey were barred altogether from doing business in the harbor. This was exactly what happened in the early 1800s. New York passed a law that gave one steamship company the right to operate steamboats between New York and New Jersey. A steamship owner from New Jersey sued. He argued that a federal law allowed him to operate his ships anywhere up and down the Atlantic coast. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1824. The court ruled that New York had no right to pass a law restricting boat owners from other states. The ruling strengthened the power of the federal government over state governments. It said that only Congress had the power to make laws affecting trade between states.
So you see there that Jefferson's cousin, who had been appointed by John Madison as one of the midnight judges, uh, was pushing nationalism and the supremacy of the Constitution over state law. John Marshall would be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for 34 years. And the various decisions that he's going to make would strengthen both the role of Constitution and the role of the government in everyday American life. The case that you just saw involving the steamboats was called Givens versus Ogden. Two other decisions, which you'll read about in your textbook, Fletcher versus Peck and the Dartmouth College case, push the supremacy and the sacredness of contracts. Once you sign a contract, then both people are obliged to obey it. The famous case of McCulloch versus Maryland, again, pushed the idea of the supremacy of the national or federal government over state government. So, judicial nationalism and the power of the federal government, all coming from the cases of John Marshall. Another man was going to try to take hold of this whirlwind of manifest destiny, movement towards land and movement west, would be Henry Clay. Henry Clay, who will get the nickname the Great Compromiser, sees the advent of roads and canals and thinks that this could be the ribbon that ties this whole package together and to make it one. So he's going to combine roads and canals with the concept of a national bank and a tariff. He's going to present a package that he calls his American system. And in that American system, the country would be united by bringing roads and canals. It would be paid for by selling stock in the Bank of the United States, and to get the North on board, a high protective tariff to protect their industries. This was a perfect way of promoting each section's desires and at the same time pulling them together. However, a roadblock occurred. That man, James Madison, on his way out as president, vetoes the bill, particularly because he felt that selling stock in the Bank of the United States was unconstitutional. And that veto spelled the end of Clay's American system. Not the end of the idea, but the end of the American system. So they have no money to build roads and canals, but they will have a national bank and they will have a high tariff. But what the roads and canals does is it leaves the South out. So you see where most of the canals were being built in the north, and again, leading to the west. Now this canal building all over the country becomes a sweeping panorama of let's copy what the other person's doing. And it's going to lead to some problems because in many places, quite honestly, the canals weren't needed. But if New York can build the Erie Canal and make it an economic giant, well, we can build the same thing even in the state of Tennessee, which proves to be a disaster. Taking Madison's place would be the former Secretary of State under Madison, and that would be James Monroe. Monroe is another Virginian. So go back to the beginning. Washington from Virginia. Adams, 1 term. Jefferson from Virginia, 2 terms. Madison from Virginia, 2 terms. And now Monroe from Virginia. All Southerners, all slaveholders. But with the advent of Monroe, it initiates something called the era of good feelings. And primarily, this concept or this idea is promoted in a Boston newspaper. Boston, the seat of federalism. Of course, Monroe, a Republican. But with essentially the death of the Federalist Party as a result of their stance during the War of 1812, leaves us with only one political party. One of the first things that Monroe is going to do when he becomes office is to visit New England, which prompted that headline. So, was this an era of good feelings? Did everybody just love one another? Did everybody get along? Not necessarily. And we'll take a look at some of those things. Now, take a look at what Monroe said. And if we look to the condition of individuals, what a proud spectacle does it exhibit. On whom has oppression fallen in any quarter of our union? Who has been deprived of any right of person or property? Well, how about women? How about Native Americans? And of course, nobody's talking about the slaves population in the South. So obviously, this does not apply to everybody. We're talking mostly about white male landowners.
Thomas Jefferson was president, he wanted to buy the port city of New Orleans from the French. The French sold him the entire Louisiana territory. After the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, the United States covered the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rocky Mountains. Politicians claimed it was our manifest destiny to govern ocean to ocean.
North, it ended at the Oregon Country, and down south, along the border of the Republic of Texas. Americans wanted the vast land that lay to the west, And later that year, a writer coined the term manifest destiny to explain why. The concept of manifest destiny was based on three beliefs. First, that the nation needed more land for its rapidly growing population. Second, that Americans could bring economic growth and democracy to places where they had never existed before. And third, that American territorial expansion was blessed by God because it was morally right. Just before the term manifest destiny was first used,
So, exactly was manifest destiny. It meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And that third thing that was just mentioned in that film clip, destined by God. Many of the wrongs throughout history have been justified by saying, I spoke directly to God. And in America, it was really no different. But grow we will, oftentimes at the expense of others, but nevertheless, it would be growth. And one of the things that oftentimes gets lost in all of this is the ideas concerning the American pioneer. Uh, these were a rugged people. Most of them had to depend strictly upon themselves. This idea of rugged individualism. They had a great uh, respect for the law, but they also were an extremely independent group. And being out where they were oftentimes cut off from the latest news or uh, some of the latest problems. They only knew it when it became directly or when it directly impacted upon them. These were, again, a tough people who put up with a lot of hardship and overcame it to continue to develop this Western push. Here you can see by taking a look at the map, this growth starting in 1800 and then stretching out to the west. You see at the bottom, Louisiana, Alabama. This becomes later known as the Black Belt. The reason for it, of course, was the black, rich soil, which was perfect for growing cotton. When you go further up, starting with Tennessee and Kentucky and then going into Illinois, of course, those are more agriculture or farming methods. Now, when Jefferson purchased Louisiana and, of course, sends the Lewis and Clark expedition, and actually where it winds up out west at Fort Clatsop in the Oregon country, the United States now has all this land, which it hopes to quickly take over with settlers. So settlement was encouraged. Land was dirt cheap and in some cases just given away, but not just to farmers. As you're going to see, it's also going to be given to a certain new idea, the corporation. And those corporations were railroads, but more about that later. Lewis and Clark, on their almost 2-year trek out and back, are going to again bring a lot of information concerning what we had just bought back to the east. One little side note. What do you think their favorite meal was, Lewis and Clark? Not buffalo, not elk, but dogs. That's right, dogs. They got so tired of eating buffalo and elk that killing a dog and then eating it was a delicacy. I guess you could say it was rather rough out there. Sorry, had to do it. Now, one of the things, of course, involved in Manifest Destiny would be taking over of Florida. How did that happen?
The early 1800s found slaves from the South escaping to Florida, where they lived in all-black villages or with the Seminole Indians. This made slave owners angry at the Spanish who owned this territory because the Spanish would not make the Indians return the slaves. Under President James Monroe, General Andrew Jackson led U.S. troops against the Seminole Indians of Spanish-held Florida. This began the Seminole War of 1818, leading to the American acquisition of Florida. Florida was purchased in 1819, and Andrew Jackson was made its governor. Under the Adams-Onis Transcontinental Treaty, Spain agreed to cede all of Florida to the United States in exchange for the dismissal of a $5 million debt. In addition, Spain gave up all claims to the Oregon Territory. The Florida Cession gave the United States parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and all of Florida.
Now, Jackson exceeded exactly what Monroe told him to do. Monroe told him to put an end to, along the border, the attacks by the Seminole coming into Georgia, and of course, the fleeing of slaves into Florida. Well, Jackson decides to exceed his orders. He captures a British ambassador who he feels is funding the Indians, and because of Jackson's hatred of the British, he executes him. He also continues down through Florida and attacks a number of cities. Well, this goes way beyond the scope of what he was empowered to do, but he's Andrew Jackson, and we'll explain what that means later. But now, Spain doesn't hold Florida. They hope to get something out of it. So, again, the Adams-Onis Treaty, a fait accompli. They got some money back in terms of not having to pay their debt and lost Florida, which they no longer held. So Jackson becomes even more of an American hero to the American voters.
The early
John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State under Monroe. Now, follow the bouncing ball. Jefferson, who was the third president, was Washington's Secretary of State. Madison, who succeeds Jefferson, was Jefferson's Secretary of State. And Monroe, who succeeded Madison, was his Secretary of State. And now John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, is now the Secretary of State. He's going to negotiate a number of very successful treaties while in that role. Adams-Onis Treaty, which we've previously talked about, getting us Florida. The Rush-Bagot Treaty and the Convention of 1824 solidified the border between Canada and the United States. And it also made the Great Lakes non-military. There would be no military bases nor warships from either country in those Great Lakes. This becomes the longest unfortified, demilitarized border in the world at that time, thus lessening the amount of tension between those two countries, Great Britain and the United States. But remember, era of good feeling? In 1820, Missouri, part of the Louisiana Purchase, decides to come into the Union as a slave state. Well, this was going to upset what had become a delicate balance. There were the same number of senators from slave and free states at that time. Missouri comes in, upsets the balance. There is now hell to pay in the halls of Congress, as this is vehemently and in some cases violently debated. the problem would be solved when Maine decides to come into the Union as a result of this man. Once again, the great compromiser, Henry Clay, would begin to build his reputation as that compromiser with what becomes known as either the Compromise of 1820 or the Missouri Compromise. Maine comes in as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, and then the drawing of a line. That line right there, 3630. This line referred strictly to the land purchased by the Louisiana Purchase. Anything above it is to remain free. Below it, slave. Of course, Missouri being the lone exception. Now, keep in mind that this land out here, which of course at that time was owned by Spain, was not affected by this. This strictly dealt with land that came in as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. So you can see the bulk of the territory was going to remain slave-free above it. But at the time, this Band-Aid approach, and that's what it really entails, this Band-Aid approach to the elephant in the room, and that, of course, is slavery, is what's going to be used time and time again. And eventually, to carry the analogy a little bit further, this wound became too big for Band-Aids to hold. Meanwhile, up in Maine, Maine had gone to war with Canada. That's right. It's the only war ever declared by a state. And this was all over logging rights. We damn near went to war as a country over this.
Let's get ready to rumble!
Let's say that the Maine lobstermen in the Aroostook War made up for Canada coming and burning our capital. Now, in the meantime, world events brought about by something called the Holy Alliance. This Holy Alliance was a response by the kings of Europe that saw their status and stature being threatened. So, the Russian Tsar, the French king, the king of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire form an alliance along with Spain, trying to make sure that they would remain in power. And one of the things they started looking at was these two men in South America, Bernardo O'Higgins and Simon Bolivar. Bolivar was considered to be the George Washington of Latin America. Country after country that you see pictured there will revolt and gain their independence from Spain. The Holy Alliance was looking to restore Spain to preeminence in that region. They also looked at Russia, which at that time claimed Alaska and claimed all the way into Canada, or into California. England, well, if there's a dollar to be made, England's going to be there. England, once Spain was removed from the equation, was reaping the benefits of having a wide open market in Latin America. But if the Holy Alliance brought the king back, that market would dry up. So England approaches the United States and proposes an alliance. That alliance between the United States and Great Britain would state that the two countries would resist any attempt to reestablish Spain in the Western Hemisphere. The offer is taken by John Quincy Adams to Monroe. But Adams states, as you see there, that it's not necessary. The British Navy will always be there. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, what Adams is saying, quite honestly, is it doesn't make any difference whether we have a treaty with Great Britain or not. Great Britain needs to keep the Holy Alliance out. So we can stay independent of them, and they still will use their navy to stop the growth of the Holy Alliance in Latin America. Instead, the United States offers something which later will become known as the Monroe Doctrine. Now, it was not called the Monroe Doctrine at the time. And honestly, it was on like the 20th page of an essay that Monroe had written and sent to Congress, which would be today called the State of the Union Address. But back then, the presidents did not address Congress. They simply sent their written speech for them to look at. Essentially, what the Monroe Doctrine said was Europe to stay out of Latin America, and we will stay out of Europe.
During the first quarter of the 19th century, besides Mexico, almost every other important colony in Latin America gained independence from its mother country in Europe. However, as this occurred, certain powerful monarchies in Europe threatened to stamp out representative governments if they developed in the old colonies. That was the reason that in 1823, President James Monroe issued his now famous policy statement called the Monroe Doctrine. In it, Monroe warned the European powers that he would consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. In other words, the Monroe Doctrine warned the European monarchies that they could expect a strong response from the United States if they interfered with the affairs of any independent nation in North or South America. The ideas spelled out in the Monroe Doctrine were very important and continue to shape American foreign policy to this very day.
Now, what was the Monroe Doctrine not? It's not a law. It was not meant, as you can see there, to bind any future presidents to a course of action. And as John Quincy Adams said, it was merely a lecture. And we don't call it a Monroe Doctrine until the 1850s. Now, have we used it since then? Absolutely. We've used it to invade numerous times, whether it be in the Dominican Republic or Haiti, in Grenada during Reagan's administration, when Bush I was president in the late 1980s, we invaded Panama, again, using the Monroe Doctrine. When this doctrine was first promoted, it was received rather well in Latin America. But later on, we started using it for our own means, and of course, soured relationships in many cases between those countries and ourselves. So a line drawn in the sand.
After the War of 1812 ended, the country was so optimistic that the period came to be known as the Era of Good Feelings. President James Monroe helped promote the feeling of national unity and patriotism. Monroe was eager to protect the Americas against European influences. So in 1823, he announced a new policy, the Monroe Doctrine. It stated that the United States would not allow European nations to interfere with Latin America. In the 1820s, a strong new leader emerged, Andrew Jackson. Jackson served as president for 8 years, a period of change that is called the Age of Jackson. During this time, ordinary people became more involved in politics.
In the election of 1824, you have just one political party, but Andrew Jackson is going to run. Again, he from the state of Tennessee. John Quincy Adams is going to run. He from Massachusetts. William Crawford is going to run. He from Georgia, the South. And Henry Clay from Kentucky is going to run. he also, like Jackson, a Westerner. So this is more of a geographic thing. Notice nobody from Virginia finally. Take a look at the votes. As you see, both popular and electoral, Jackson wins. But even though he had 38 electoral votes, it wasn't enough, according to the Constitution. So this becomes a tie. And the three top vote getters, Jackson, Adams, and Crawford, who by that time was suffering from a stroke and incapable of really running for office, their names go to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay cannot stand Jackson, and he throws his support to John Quincy Adams in return for Adams promising to push for Clay's American system. So, despite losing both the popular and electoral vote, John Quincy Adams legally becomes president of the United States. Clay is then made Secretary of State by Adams. Now, think about it. Go back to the litany that I previously gave you. John Quincy Adams, the latest Secretary of State to become President of the United States. Now, notice he's also the son of a former president from Massachusetts. So all our presidents to this point have come from either Massachusetts or Virginia. Adams offers Clay the role as Secretary of State. And honestly, it made quite sense. The problem was...
Over? Did you say over? Nothing is over until we decide it is.
Adams making Clay Secretary of State, it looks like that was the deal that was struck. You vote for me, I make you Secretary of State, which of course was not the case. This becomes known as the corrupt bargain.
Bad boy, what you want, what you want.
That's the headlines. Now, this corrupt bargain is going to be a charge that sticks. Was it true? No. But it's going to color Adams' entire term as president and really stops him from achieving much, if anything. Like his father, he was not a good politician. He's also going to be haunted by a political mistake, something known as the Tariff of Abominations. His vice president, John C. Calhoun, proposes behind the scenes to have a tariff so high that Adams would have to veto it. Now, this would anger his base in the North and cost him re-election. Well, surprise, surprise, Adams signs it into law. Of course, the North is thrilled with it, but the South and the West, not so much, because it makes goods that they're getting from England too expensive to buy. So, in the next election, 28, it's just two candidates, but in this case, as you see, it's not even close. Andrew Jackson becomes president of the United States. John Quincy Adams loses and will be the first ex-president ever to come back as a member of the House of Representatives, when later on he represents Massachusetts in a rather difficult time period, which we'll talk about later, involving a slave ship called the Amistad. But now Andrew Jackson, extremely popular and extremely bullheaded, much like a man who admired him later on, that man, Donald Trump. But we'll talk more about that later.